Okay, welcome. So this is something that is not thoroughly developed at this point. Mostly an idea, but and I'm looking for feedback here and next steps. So questions are certainly welcome, and suggestions and so forth. So references in Wikidata. We're all familiar with Wikipedia's citation needed template. So references are important. The way it works in Wikidata is every statement has its own reference. They're attached to the statement. They're not really on the item so much as on the statement itself. So that's good. We want data to be verifiable, but there are a couple of issues with it. First of all, entering the same reference. So often you have many pieces of data on an item, and many of them come from the same source. So the same reference is responsible for that particular piece of data, for each of those pieces of data. So there are some tools to help with that. Duplicate references, I guess, is a gadget, which easily lets you copy one reference statement, one reference section from one statement to another statement with just a few clicks. So that's simple, but of course it's duplicating the data. And similarly, the user's ref script, that allows you to use, select one of the external identifiers for an item, and assuming it has certain properties attached to that external ID, it kind of automatically creates references from those that attach to any statement that you want. So both of those allow you to basically create the same references multiple times on an item. So great, we have reference statements, they're all cited, but we hit storage limits. There's a maximum size for items in Wikidata, and the size of these reference sections on statements can be quite substantial. So Mahir gave a talk at WikidataCon that touched on this and this issue of duplicated references. And there's several areas where I've been doing some work in Wikidata that are really severely hampered by these duplicated references. So I'm going to look at one particular example. I'm going to bring it up over here in Wikidata itself. I already opened it up. So you'll see, hopefully this is visible to everybody yet. This has 3,000 authors, and each of the authors, at least potentially, has the exact same reference claims, right? And if you go look at the size of this item, which you can see from history, it's 4.4 megabytes. That's basically the limit, or very close to the limit of how big something can be in Wikidata. So 3,000 authors, potentially all the same. Actually, there was a bot that was adding these references, and it ran out of room. So not everything has that reference statement. But the item has become uneditable. Essentially, you can't really add anything to it because it doesn't have any more room for anything. It also has 50 cites work statements, which are identical to one another. And there's several cases, not this particular one, but there's a couple of other cases I've run into where some of these have been duplicated. I guess one was imported from Crossref and one was imported from PubMed or something like that. And is missing the DOI, and so they weren't matched up right away or something. And so we have two enormous items with 3 or 4 megabytes in size, and merging them is absolutely impossible. So yeah, it's not a good situation. And so as James was pointing out in the Etherpad, the RDF format in the WD query system, Wikidata queries, does not have this problem. Duplicate references turn into a single collection of triples, and the only thing specific to each item is that relationship between the item statement and this reference with the prov was derived from predicate. So the size problem is not an issue for the number of triples in RDF, which is what our previous talk was talking about. But it is a problem for the Wikidata items themselves. So possible solutions. So obviously, if very similar statements on the item, like the authors all have the same reference, maybe it's fine to just have that reference on one or a couple of the authors instead of all 3,000 in this case. And so I've actually done that to some of these items just to make them editable, but it's not really the right solution. I mean, yeah, it's true that in English Wikipedia you have, or any language Wikipedia, you have a lot of statements that are in the text that are not referenced, but Wikidata is kind of intended to be something where each statement can be looked up to verify that it's true. So I mentioned this possible solution one, but I'm discounting it. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. So number 2, change the JSON storage format. There's no particular reason I can think of why we have to store the reference on each statement in the JSON as it is. It could be transformed into something like what the RDF does, and automatically consolidate those duplicate references. But of course, making that change would mean some changes in Wikibase. So there's a challenge there. So I'll talk about that a bit more. But third possible solution is just adding a couple of properties and using them. And I'll show you how that works with some examples I set up on test Wikidata. And maybe that particular property arrangement I'm suggesting isn't the only one that could work. So if there are alternatives that people can think of, let's discuss those as well. So first of all, yeah. So seeing this is the item I created on test Wikidata. It's just a very simple test item. Has one label, one description. It has a few statements, and each of them have a stated in, an identical stated in reference with retrieved rate. Okay, so that's not very much. But if you look at what each of those references looks like, this is what they look in the raw JSON. There's a references section on the item, on the statement. So in the JSON, it has a hash, which is this long string, and then it has the actual data values in here, the property, the item QID, and then the retrieve date, the date timestamp data format. So this identical reference thing is repeated 4 times because I had 4 statements with exactly the same hash value, exactly the same content in the JSON. So that was, Mahir pointed that out too. So here's a suggestion for an alternative storage format in the JSON. Instead of storing the reference on each statement in full, just store the hash to the reference, and then on the item at the end somewhere else in the JSON, store a references section with the full hash, but only once for each of these references. So in this example, the space savings would be, there's a calculation here about the space savings here. So for this particular example, it would be 1.5 kilobytes smaller, and for 3,000 authors, or number of copies of the reference, that would be 1.5 megabytes. So that's a pretty significant fraction of the 3 or 4 megabytes of the size of some of these problem cases. So I don't know how practical it would be to do this kind of change in the JSON format. It seems like something that that could be done, but yeah. So that's solution 2, and I guess if it makes the most sense to do this, we can create Fabricator ticket or something to work on it. What are the implications of doing this change? So, you know, the display in the Wikidata UI could be exactly the same, and just, you know, translate from one format to the other for display purposes. But there could be also some recognition that that the same reference is applied on each of the statements. So, you know, similar to the way it works in the language Wikipedias, you could have a reference section at the bottom or somewhere separate, and then a little, you know, footnote on each of the statements indicating which reference applies, so that that would actually save space in the UI and make it a little more usable, perhaps. And then if, you know, if we have this sort of situation with duplicated references, would it make sense to allow one edit to, if you wanted to change those references, if you wanted to change all of those cases, you know, maybe editing should be a little different than the way it works now with each one listed separately. So anyway, some issues possibly for the Wikidata UI. Yeah, and mapping to RDF should be simpler. I'm not really sure how other APIs, I mean, the REST API, I think the REST API already does a change in the JSON format from the storage format. So, you know, maybe it would make sense to have something similar there. We probably need some sort of transition period where both were supported. Maybe some versioning on the somewhere in the JSON would make sense. Anyway, maybe there are other impacts. I don't know. This is kind of my list of what I thought might be an issue. So that's the second option. Third option, new properties. So here's what I'm proposing, I guess, as a more quicker fix if it's something we really want to do. And I'm eager to do it. So here's an example where I created new properties on test Wikidata. And so the new properties are basically a C reference property so as a reference, you just have a number, a label. And so you can, within within the Wikidata item, all the statements have references that are just, you know, C reference. And then the reference, there's a separate reference property on the item. So this statement just has, you know, particular, this is reference 1, and then it has as qualifiers the statements that were in the, or the, you know, the details of the reference. So it could be as qualifiers. Maybe it should be as the reference on that reference. I don't know. Maybe the name needs to be a little bit different to be clear. But anyway, that's the idea. So sorry. So new reference property C reference with a string value, the label, and then a new main statement property, the string value is label, and the rest of the references qualifiers. If you look at the way that's stored in Wikidata, it's still creating that hash for each of those reference entities, and exactly the same one. If it's all C reference 1, they're all the same, but they're quite a bit smaller. They're about a third of the size of the or less of the original reference statement, which had several pieces to it. So for 3,000 identical references, that would still save about 1 megabyte on the size. So going with properties, there really isn't any need to involve the developers on this. although maybe it would be nice again to have some way to to make the references look a little bit more like regular language Wikipedias. Fetching references becomes a little more complex because the C reference obviously is just returning it's another level of indirection to the actual reference statement that needs to be fetched. So anybody who actually cares to pull the actual references would need to modify their RDF or their Sparkle query to get them. There are some constraint violation issues possibly if using them as qualifiers. If we just add them as reference entries, then that wouldn't be an issue. And maybe there's some other impacts that people can think of here, but I think it could work. So this is the main subject I wanted to cover here. Yeah, so here we go. Are there any questions right now? So anyway, just to summarize, removing redundant references was my first solution. Changing the JSON format section solution. New set of properties, new pair of properties, I guess, for handling references in Wikidata, and obviously people would have to adopt this and make use of it, and maybe we'd need some bots to switch at least the severe cases to the new format. And what does it make sense to do next here? So I'm open for questions and seeing.
Thanks so much, Arthur. Yeah. I'll bring you some questions from the chat. Nikki in the chat said, I don't think the UI would need to change. That seems independent of the underlying storage. Would you like to speak to that, or we can move on to the next one?
Yeah, it wouldn't need to change. The issue, I think, is that if the underlying storage is sort of representing identical statements, it's consolidating duplicated references, then maybe it would be best if the UI actually showed you that it was doing that, but not necessary. Yeah, I agree.
Tuka here also said, could this change be completely internal and the conversation from the current format to the proposed format? What would happen when the data is stored and looked up in the database?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the same the same question, right? Yeah, so it could be just a storage format, and then the format that was shown for display would be same. I mean, that's I don't know what the performance impact would be or anything on that, because I guess the server side storing would have to do that for every item, but it doesn't seem like it would be a big deal, and of course WDQS is doing that right now, so.
Yeah, I mean, Nikki also mentioned that they're not keen on storing references as qualifiers of another statement, and that makes the underlying data model kind of pointless, since references are now main snacks and qualifiers, not references.
Right. Yeah, that's what I mentioned about using using it. Using instead of qualifiers, of course, we could just make them as reference statements on the reference item. I don't have a strong preference. I think that would be fine.
Tuka also has compressed the JSON before storing it or calculating its size for the selection 4.
Can you clarify that? Maybe is there?
I'll see what Tuka, if they have anything else they would like to add.
What we try to achieve is just smaller storage. Then the simplest way would be just to compress the JSON, right? So no need to plan a new way of, because in a way here we are trying to compress the representation, and compression algorithms exist and they are quite efficient.
So you're saying, for example, a gzip or something of the JSON? Is that
exactly?
Oh, okay. I don't know. Yeah, there may be some issues with how like the search indexing works. I don't know. Yeah, it would have to. Yeah, that might be complicated, but yeah, okay. Another option. Definitely another option.
Sky also mentions here that they don't think option 3 makes a whole lot of sense for them, but they said that we can point to other entities as the objects of reference statements where the complexity of the reference can be documented.
Right. But even so, a stated in reference is quite large, as opposed to just this label thing, because it's embodying the entire item. The item data type takes more space than a simple string label. So I mean, it doesn't quite solve it.
I'm just going through more of the comments here. Nikki also said it already reuses hashes as far as they know. If the references are the same, and we could have a way to edit all the references that are the same on an item without changing the data model at all. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that would be a UI a UI thing that could be done even without. No, that's a good point. But yeah.
Are there any other questions that anyone has for Arthur?
Is there anything in the so James in the Etherpad wrote about the data structure and the query service, but I think I addressed that. Yeah. So there was a question there, I guess, about decorating with additional information, like reference supports qualifier type thing. I don't really. Yeah, that would. If you have additional, if each if each statement has a slightly different reference, then it's going to have a different hash, and that's going to. So that's none of what I proposed here will actually help with that, except that I guess the additional properties, maybe that would make sense. So you could have C reference 1 and then reference supports qualifier or something as a reference, but then the full reference is listed later. So maybe it would help with that. I haven't thought about that much. That's a good point. And then there's a comment, there's a question, Sky, in the Etherpad, overly complicated documentation references. It's important to maintain the ability to have individual references on each statement because they all may derive from a different provenance trace, right? We can run Sparkle queries for very diverse information coming from all across Wikidata and use what was derived from to get all the details on claim source. We should have more references pointing to other items. Yeah, okay, that's kind of what we talked about already. I don't know who made the comment, a wish for a tool to bulk replace longhand citations with items. Somebody want to?
That's from Andy.
Ah, right.
Andy, do you want to elaborate on that? If you're here, Andy?
Yep.
Oh, good. Yeah, the Etherpad and the chat both have a link to the diff where I gave an example, very similar to the examples that Arthur gave, of an item that had, I think, 30 references, which were all the same. And I created an item for the item that was referenced, for the work that was referenced, and then carried out, and again, I give the figure, but I can't remember it off the top of my head, all the changes that were necessary. 20 edits, which took over 80 mouse clicks to replace all those references with a stated in and a QID. And at the end of it, my hand was hurting. So I thought, well, I could really do with a tool that would do all of this in one go, even if it only did it on one item. I mean, if it did it on multiple items, even better. But even if it only did one item, so far I haven't found a coder, and I'm no coder myself, unfortunately, who's willing to make this tool. But if somebody would like to make it, it wouldn't resolve the issue that Arthur's described, but it would help us to resolve it on an individual basis, item by item, as we're editing other things.
It certainly might help with some cases of the type of thing I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So I shall keep banging on asking for people to make this tool every time I get the opportunity.
Yeah, sounds good.
I mean, you're in the right place.
There was a comment about the impact on dumps. Does anybody have any information about how some Meldrick here, an impact on dumps, either how long it takes to generate or reusers? So, I mean, I assume that if we made the Wikidata items smaller than the dumps, the JSON dumps should be smaller. Is that true, or would they need to be reformatted anyway? Or... No comments.
Meldrick, you mentioned that this could possibly have an impact on dumps, either how long it takes to generate them, if we keep the current file format, or on reuse of these dumps. Do you want to add some more to that? And does anybody else have any questions or anything else they'd like to comment for Arthur?
So there's a question about the REST API. So it does have a different format. It does have a different format for the strings and snacks and so on. In regular main statements. So it's a slightly more compact JSON version of the same data. Yeah, I'm wondering if, I don't know if Lydia or anybody from Wikidata, the development side has any insight on maybe the REST format could be.
Yeah, I think Ollie, who just posted a link. Ollie, do you want to take that? I think you're destined for this question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hi. I just posted a link to some docs which sort of outlines what the changes are between the Action API and the new REST API. And indeed, there are differences between the references. Generally, the same information is mostly there. It's just sort of compacting it a little bit. So the same thing is repeated over and over again. Hopefully that answers the question. If you've got anything more specific, I can try and answer that as well.
Thanks so much, Ollie.
Yeah, it looks like the references are in more compact format, but you've done away with the hash, so that kind of is that true? There's no hash in the.
It looks like the hash is still there. Yeah, the hash still is there from the docs point of view.
In the REST API format, is it? Wait.
Yeah, in the REST API and on the Action API, the hash is present.
I don't see it in the link that you provided in the examples.
If you scroll down to where it says statement references. Yeah.
The old is got a references and then a hash, and then the new one just has a references and the hash is empty.
It looks like
maybe it's displaying strangely. Okay, that's it. Never mind. I got it. Yeah, it is.
Great.
Okay, but it still is a more compact format a little bit.
There's a couple more questions in the chat from Friedrich. Considering the storing space used by references when referring to an authority file for which an external link is already present on the item, I guess it would make sense not to create any redundancy by adding this authority file ID or reference URL in the reference, right?
So story. Are we referring to references on the external ID, or? I think for the most part sometimes we add those, sometimes we don't. I don't know. Yeah, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, because I do look into those RDB files all the time to try to not only substantiate subclasses statements. It can be useful for that. But then I wonder, does it make sense to state the ID again in the reference when it's already present on the item? Because that makes the reference longer and therefore uses more storage space. And if it's a good practice not to create any of this kind of redundancy, could we consider a UI feature to display the ID and the link so that users can more easily check the reference without requiring this information to be stated directly into the reference?
Right, I see what you're saying. So I think it's useful to have the ID as part of the reference, even though you're referring to that authority, because it could be that somebody might edit the item and change the ID on the item or something. So at least we have a record on the reference of what it was. Yeah, I don't know. I think the users ref tool, when you use that script, it does copy the ID, the external ID, into the reference too. So yeah, but there's a piece of redundancy that maybe we don't need. But if we could consolidate all those references into one thing anyway, then it wouldn't be so bad. But yeah, that's a good question. Aaron, there were some more. Do you want to go through the other ones here?
Yeah, sure. I guess we have Nikki saying, we don't add the reference URL if the property has a formatted URL, but it's good practice to add the ID because we can't guarantee that the ID currently on the item is the one that was used for the reference.
Yeah, that was what I was trying to say too. Yeah. Hogu had a comment. When should there be a created?
Hogu said, I forgot the word item before the word created. But maybe they said something before. Yes, that's what it was. When should there be an item created and used as a reference with the moving content about the reference to the item that is usually mentioned as a reference directly at an item?
Use a reference. Right. Yeah, so that's a debate, I guess. So a lot of these, like those author references that I mentioned, they're all referring to, the Astrophysics Data Service, so it's stated in that, and then it has an ID, and it has so there already is sort of an item. The problem is that there's some additional information about that item, like and when it was retrieved and what was the ID that it refers to in the item. So I don't think it would make any sense at all to create an item that was that specific, stated in this item and with this ID and at this point in time, right? But on the other hand, there's a lot of cases where it's a specific. We're referring to, the reference is a reference URL, and it was retrieved on this date, and it has this author and has this title, right? So all those details, it might make sense to have that as an item on its own, because it is a source that you know. So sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. I don't know if we have strong guidelines on this, or any other comments on that. Maybe Etherpad would be a good place to put some thoughts on that. Let's see. Okay, Ollie. Right.
Does anybody else have anything else that they'd like to add, or comments or questions for Arthur?
So I do want to try to get a consensus, if people could, on what we should do next year. Should we push for? It seemed like people were not particularly happy with the solution 3 I proposed of new properties. So do we want to do an RFC to try to get a consensus on?
We can do a poll here in Jitsi if you want. I can set one up.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe just
give me a second.
Option 2 or option 3, I guess.
So do you want between the next steps or solution 1, 2, 3?
Oh, yeah. Could we do a poll with 2 questions?
Sure. Then we'll do that.
Looks like people are adding their preferences in the comment here. Anyway, everybody wants the developers to do the work here. Well.
All right. So here's question 1. I will add the second one in a second.
Thank you so much for putting that together, Lydia.
Sure.
Where's the poll step? Oh, poll.
All right, and there's the second one.
If somebody selects other on the second one, maybe they can comment on what they're proposing we should do. I guess fabricator. Maybe we should have put fabricator in there as a option. Anyway. Well, thank you, everybody.
This is amazing. Seeing all the numbers come through. I don't want to sway anyone's vote, but we can collect this and put this in the Etherpad once it's all done. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add to Arthur or discuss the next steps, the solutions for the other proposals?
So what I was thinking with the RFC was just to try to refine exactly what we're asking the developers to do here. But if that is what we want to do.
Nikki said they selected other because they don't think that project chat, RFC, or property proposals are any use in making a technical change.
I mean, if we're ready to go straight to Fabricator with this proposal, then we could just do that, I guess. All right.
All right. Thank you so much. If nobody else has anything to add, we can close the conversation there. Thank you so much for your talk. Would you like to say any last words, Arthur?
Well, just I appreciate that we got some good feedback and conversation here. So thank you, everybody.